Hello, everyone. I hope you're all ready and excited to review Period 5. And Period 5, not gonna lie, there's a lot of information, which is why I am dividing the review up into two parts. So this video is gonna go over the first half of Period 5, which will be all of the people and places and events right before the Civil War, and then the second half will cover the Civil War and Reconstruction. So for the period as a whole, though, it's from 1844 to 1877. So we start with the election of James Polk. So we'll talk about more land acquisitions, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and John Brown and all of the abolitionists. And then we'll end with Reconstruction. So not just the end of the Civil War, but the end of the formal Reconstruction period. So we start with the exciting topic of the economy and how the economy was different for these three regions of the United States. And when we talk about these three regions of the United States, and we talked about this in the last period as well, we need to talk about this idea of sectionalism, and how the North, the South, and the West were developing very differently, and how this development will ultimately lead to the Civil War, because each region is basically looking out for themselves and their own interests economically, and we all know that money drives everything. Money drives all of your choices and your likes and your dislikes. So the North was becoming very industrialized, where the South was not. The North was advancing in transportation and industry and banking, which we know will all be advantages for them in the Civil War. And the South will not have these things, unfortunately. The South remained mostly agrarian. Probably 90% of the people who had a job in the South worked with agriculture in some sense. Tobacco and cotton required vast acreage, so there were a lot of big landowners. Southerners were constantly looking west for more land, and we know that our friend Andrew Jackson will help them with that. They also looked for new slave territories to include in the Union in order to strengthen their position in Congress. So when we talk about all these compromises and provisos and etc., pieces of legislature, a big goal, the more states and the more people you have that agree with slavery, then the more power and the more say-so you're going to have in Congress. Thus, the more likely it'll be that slavery remains legal. And most Southerners really desired that, not for racist reasons, but for economic reasons. And in the West, it was kind of a hodgepodge of both North and the South. There were a lot of farmers, because most of those pioneers that had moved west came from the South anyways. A big industry for the West was real estate speculation, which means, to speculate means to like kind of take a gamble or take a gamble and assume that this land's going to be profitable, so I'm going to buy it now and then sell it later for a higher value or price. The West distrusted the North, which they regarded as the home of powerful banks, which could take their land, and they had little use for the South, whose rigid hierarchical society was at odds with their egalitarian society. The South was very much based on this hierarchy where you had slaves at the bottom and plantation owners at the top, whereas in the West, they promoted egalitarianism, meaning everyone's equal, we don't have social classes, etc. We're all just here to work and start a new life. Moving on to social history, which really interlaps and intertwines it. Did I skip something? Really twines itself with economic history. The cotton gin altered Southern agriculture. We talked about this in the last period. Again, that's how social and economics kind of blend together, because slavery was a part of the hierarchy and the social classes of the South, but the reason they needed more slaves was because of the invention of the cotton gin and the profitability of cotton. So commerce led to a larger middle class, especially in the north. Westward migration created a new frontier culture, and each of these sets of circumstances influenced people's attitudes and ambitions, particularly regarding slavery and its legitimacy and morality. And a good thing to remember regarding the test is that these generalizations about the different regions of the U.S. So see on your notes on your review guide, there's a chart, a box that breaks up social history of the North, the South, and the West. Those are the generalizations I'm talking about. Knowing those generalizations will help you answer specific questions because you'll be able to put two and two together and think, okay, so the North does support the Bank of the United States and the South does not. So knowing what I know, how can I answer this question? Here it is. Again, if a question asks you about a particular tariff and you're like, oh my gosh, I've never heard of the tariff of 1828, or I don't know about this random tariff, it doesn't matter because you will know that the South doesn't like any tariff. They don't want any tax on imported goods because they rely on imports so much. So those types of generalizations will help you answer a lot of different types of questions. So we're going to walk through each region, north, south, and west, just a little bit. The north, during the colonial era and even kind of today, the north has always been the nation's industrial and commercial center. They were much more modern in terms of like living situations. They had waste disposal, there were sewers, there was streets and stop signs, and everything was just more modern all around. Epidemics were not only likely but inevitable because of the close compactness of the cities. And northern farmers were unable to compete with cheaper produce carted in from the west and the south using all of these new canals, such as the Erie Canal and the National Road that we talked about in the last period. The middle class of the North were made up by tradesmen, store owners, other professionals. Thus, women could devote themselves to being the mother. And this is known as the cult of domesticity. The root word of this is domestic. And this is actually a pretty important piece to understand because you never know, you might get a question that asks you to describe like the continuity and change over time of women. And this definitely would be a good place to start this cult of domesticity because women were viewed as the homemakers, and the reason they needed to stay home was to educate their children so that their children become good Republican, not like Democrat and Republican, but like good citizens of a republic, and that they're educated and they know about the world. We also start to see the rush of immigrants from Europe. This is not the big rush like we'll see during the Gilded Age in the early 1900s, but it's a pretty good push of immigrants. But these immigrants are primarily from Northern and Western Europe, but the immigrants that we'll see during the Gilded Age will be from Southern and Eastern Europe. So Northern and Western Europe, we're talking about the Irish and the German. Most Irish were coming to the northern parts of the United States in the 1840s and 50s due to the Irish potato famine. Potatoes were a pretty big crop for the livelihood of Irish, and when after many, many months of rain and all the potatoes began to rot, and so they didn't have that crop to rely on, people literally started dying left and right. So a lot of Irish fled Ireland and came to cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston. And the Germans primarily came to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania as well. But the Germans were wealthier than the Irish. And so the Germans were able to leave the big city that they docked in and move further west and move into the country. So all the Amish territories that we see today are usually descendants of those Germans that left the big city. A lot of Irish were met with hostility, primarily due to their Catholic roots. We know through American history that Protestants, which are Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, they do not particularly get along with Catholics, and most Irish were Catholics, so the Irish were discriminated. This common acronym NINA, No Irish Need Apply, was more common than not to be seen posted in windows. Irish were not very welcome, which, with this big influx of immigrants, would lead to the Know Nothing political party. And we'll bring this party back up later, but you know that they won't last very long. We don't have them anymore today, but their primary purpose, like what most members had in common, was the opposition of Catholics and immigrants because of the fear that they would take the current Americans' jobs. For the South, there were few urban areas in the South, and by 1860, the population density of Georgia was only 18 people per square mile. So the South was definitely not as densely populated as the North, which meant they also had less members in the House of Representatives. Everybody has the same amount in the Senate, but the number of people you have in the House is based on your population. So while the North continued to industrialize and develop railroads and canals, the South did not, which would hurt them during the Civil War. And the South did not also develop a strong market economy, which we talked about in period 4, and the importance of a market economy, and which is basically consumerism. A little bit about, we talked about the black codes during the last period too, but one of the reasons for the black codes for being initiated in the South was to prevent slaves from owning guns, from reading and writing, and from collaborating and communicating and coming together and gathering in large groups, because all of those things mixed together could possibly cause a slave rebellion or a slave uprising, like we saw with Nat Turner's slave rebellion. Okay, here we go. This is where your review guide picks up. We're going to talk about the Second Great Awakening. Remember, the First Great Awakening primarily took place in the South, and it's what truly brought Christianity to the South with the Baptist and the Methodist churches. Now, in the 1790s, all the way through the 1820s, the Second Great Awakening will take place all over the country, all through the North, the South, and the West. Especially in New York, there was an area called the Burned Over District, which they said spiritual fervor set the area on fire. So many people converted to Christianity in this burnt over district of New York. It gave birth to numerous societies, this is going to be important in just a second, that dedicated themselves to saving humanity from its worst impulses, and those societies will be called utopian societies. They believed that if they lived their lives a certain way, they create this perfect utopian world, then God would be pleased with them and they would be living a life not in sin, as opposed to those who were not a part of their utopian society. The most active members of the Baptist and Methodist churches that sprung up during these revivals were women, which would lead to the Temperance Society. Now, the big temperance movement won't be until the Gilded Age in the early 1900s, but it got its start during the Second Great Awakening, which makes sense because, number one, a lot of the temperance movement's beliefs are based in religion, and then, of course, number two, most people who took part in both the Great Awakening and the temperance movement were women. So naturally, this would be something that would come about. Other movements that arose during this time were Dorothea Dix's reformation of penitentiaries. She sought to rehabilitate criminals, and instead of prisons being somewhere where criminals sit and rot, she believed that penitentiary should be somewhere where criminals are reformed and rehabilitated. They maybe learn to read, they learn a new skill, they maybe turn their life around, turn over a new leaf rather than sitting and rotting in a cell. This idea of transcendentalism goes along with the utopian society. So to follow or agree with transcendentalism means that you believe that society corrupts purity of the individual. Thus, individuals are best when they are self-reliant. So if you move to one of these utopian societies, it's because you believe that the outside world corrupts you. So you need to kind of remove yourself and do your own thing in order to live a pure life. And Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, two very famous authors, were big supporters of transcendentalism and really, being one with nature and discovering your inner self. Another example of a utopian society that actually still, well, I don't want to say they still exist, but a part of them still exists. Those are the Shakers. I say a part of them still exists because there is still Shaker furniture that is produced in the North, and it's like pretty quality furniture. And that was how these Shakers, the originals, made their money, was by making high quality furniture. Anyways, they splintered off from the Quakers, so they're very peaceful, tolerant and pacifist group. However, they practice celibacy, so the only way that their group would grow is if outsiders came in. No new members were conceived, so to speak. Let's move on. The Mormon Church was also founded during this time of the Second Great Awakening, when Joseph Smith discovered the Book of Mormon, which connected the Indian tribes to the lost tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes that descended or were created during the time of the Old Testament. And however, though they faced strong opposition in the East, in the Midwest, a lot of Baptists and Methodists, because they created their own book, right? Like, people who believed in the Bible wouldn't necessarily agree with them. So that's why the Mormon hub is in Salt Lake City, Utah, because Utah was still very underdeveloped. It wasn't even a state yet, it was still a territory. So Joseph Smith and Brigham Young moved to Utah to begin their church and their following during this time. And of course, in 1848, we can't forget about the Seneca Falls Convention and the women's rights movement with Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And this is the first time that a group of women came together, like legitimately came together and said, we have something that we are lacking, and that was rights, particularly suffrage, the right to vote. So they adopted the Declaration of Sentiments, which was kind of a spin-off of the Declaration of Independence, declaring that all people, women and men, had God-given, unalienable rights. And they, of course, challenged and did not agree with the cult of domesticity. Frederick Douglass was there. An important connection to make between him and them is how this all began. These women, their husbands were abolitionists, and so they traveled with their husbands a lot to big abolitionist rallies, but they were not allowed to participate in the rallies because they were women. So they realized, why are we fighting for African American and slave rights when we don't have any rights ourselves? So that began the inspiration for the women's rights movement. There was also a shift in education during this time, for public education specifically, by a man named Horace Mann. And he kind of started the idea of state and national standards with these McGuffey readers and standardized textbooks. That way, all children are learning the same, generally, the same content for each grade level, and etc. So when we talk about the abolitionist movement, know that most abolitionists, those who fought for the freedom of slaves, sought gradual abolition or gradual emancipation, as well as this very short lived movement of actually returning African Americans to Africa. There was a small society in Liberia where Africans from the United States were literally going back to Africa and kind of starting over from their roots, but this was very short lived. Moderates obviously wanted emancipation to take place slowly, whereas people known as immediatists, as their name implies, wanted emancipation immediately. A very famous abolitionist was the author or journalist William Lloyd Garrison, and this is him here, who published his newspaper called The Liberator. He was from Pennsylvania, so pretty neutral ground, not somewhere in the deep south, but The Liberator did a really good job of discussing slavery and putting it right in front of people's faces. And Frederick Douglass, who we should all know, was a protege, kind of worked underneath William Lloyd Garrison, and eventually began his own newspaper, kind of a spin-off, called the North Star. Other prominent abolitionists you should be familiar with are Harriet Tubman, who led the slaves out of the South on the Underground Railroad, and Sojourner Truth, who was more of an activist and a speaker. She was a former slave, just like Harriet Tubman, and she's most known for her speech called If I Ain't a Woman. You should look that up. It's interesting. So as we move towards the Civil War, just some instances and presidents you should be aware of. James Polk was elected, and he was a Democrat who was against the previous Whig leader Henry Clay of Clay's American System. And Polk's campaign slogan was 54, 40, or fight. And you're probably like, why is his slogan just a bunch of numbers? But he's referring to the lines of latitude and longitude. And this is the 1840s. And so we have the Louisiana Territory, and we're still working on like California, Oregon, Texas, etc. And so America's northwestern border, he believed, should be extended to the line of 5440, which is actually higher than where the Oregon and Canadian border meet today. But he was kind of like, hey, vote for me, elect me, and I will make this happen. Because remember, Manifest Destiny and westward expansion was still a big priority for a lot of people. Polk wanted the immediate annexation of Texas because remember, Texas had been their own country at this time due to the fact that they wanted to be a slave state. Polk won the presidency, and President Tyler proposed the annexation of Texas, saying Polk's win was a mandate, and then Texas was annexed in 1845. So a lot of people attribute that to Polk. Polk realized that the United States would hardly afford to fight two territorial wars at the same time, that between Britain and Mexico. So he softened his position on Canada, which is why the line is divided where it is today at the 49th parallel, because he basically realized that, okay, if I have to fight someone, do I want to fight Mexico and gain all of this land that would be New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, or just scoot my border down a little bit and not have to fight Great Britain? So Polk concentrated his efforts on the Southwest and started the Mexican-American War with Mexico. And I say he started it because what happened was the border between the United States and Mexico at the time was the Rio Grande River, which is in Texas today, which was still, the border of America and Mexico then. And so what he did is he positioned American troops right there on the border. And those troops, when they crossed over the line, Mexican troops, of course, fired on them. So Americans died. And so this got wind back to Congress, and Congress was like, oh my gosh, Americans died. We have to declare war on Mexico. How convenient. Sounds exactly like what Polk wanted to happen. So Polk used this to send a declaration of war to Congress, and now we are officially at war with Mexico in order to gain the land in the Southwest, which would also be the last piece of territory we would need to complete Manifest Destiny and westward expansion. So most Americans did not support the Mexican-American War, simply for the fact that they're like, really? We're fighting over land? Opponents argued that Polk had provoked Mexico, so it wasn't a fair war. So there was a kind of sort of compromise issued known as the Wilmot Proviso. And the Wilmot Proviso said that if we won the war and we gained this land, slavery would be prohibited in any territory gained from Mexico, which reinforced the suspicion of like, what is the real purpose of gaining this land? But this never passed anyways, so nobody needed to worry about it. So the Mexican-American War concluded with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which the United States gained the soon-to-be states of Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada, and Utah. And this event of gaining this land was known as the Mexican Cession, and the Mexican Cession completed Manifest Destiny and westward expansion. Let me go back and see what I just skipped. Oh, right. This debate over free state or slave state will lead to the formation of the Free Soil Party, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. But just so you know, if you claim to be a free soiler, then you believe that slavery should not extend any further west. You're fine with slavery staying in the South for economic reasons, but it shouldn't expand westward because it hurt the settlers. It hurt the settlers and their ability to find work and to make money. They believed that it was not up to the federal government to decide whether or not an area or a territory or a state should be free or a slave. It was up to the people. So a big issue, and your next question regarding all of these new territories and yay, the completion of Manifest Destiny, was the issue regarding slavery and whether or not a territory or a state would be slave or free. And so our next big compromise to try and solve that debate will be the Compromise of 1850. And the Compromise of 1850, first of all, would resolve the issue over California. And California was a big problem because it was so populous. So we know that they will have a lot of representation in the House of Representatives. California had already drawn up their own state constitution that prohibited slavery, so we knew clearly how they felt about that. Pro-slavery forces argued Southern California should be forced to accept slavery due to this line of 3630, but we'll see how that plans out. So our man Stephen Douglas, who we will see later, but he is a senator from Illinois, And he was leading the way. Let's see, where's Illinois? He was leading the way in creating this transcontinental railroad. But this transcontinental railroad would go through all of this new territory. And to do that, he needs to set up some sort of government, create these territories into a state. So he and, again, Henry Clay hammered out what would be known as the Compromise of 1850, which does all of these things. And you need to know all these things. Number one, it admitted California as a free state. It created the territories of Utah and New Mexico, but left the decision of slavery up to each territory, which we know is known as popular sovereignty when they get to choose for themselves. The U.S. government paid $10 million for this territory right here, and it banned slavery or the slave trade in Washington, D.C., which is a big deal because Washington, D.C. was a huge hub for the slave market. So that question, how was the issue of representation in the New West solved? It was solved through the Compromise of 1850, and you should know all these different parts of it. The Compromise of 1850 reinforced the concept of popular sovereignty, which was very popular among people because it really emulates or goes along with the idea of small federal government and strong state government because it's giving more power to the people, allowing them to choose. And this part of making the Compromise of 1850, making slavery illegal in Washington, D.C., reinforced the fugitive slave law. Hello. Reinforced the fugitive slave law, making it more likely that a runaway slave would be captured and returned to their owner in the South. You should be familiar with this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. That is a woman. And this book, even though Harriet Beecher Stowe was a Northern woman she was a white woman, by the way. She was not a slave. She had never met a slave. But this narrative about the slave, Uncle Tom, brought to light a lot of people's dislike of slavery and how this character was treated in this book. Continuing with the discussion of how the issue over free or slave state would lead to the Civil War, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas and Nebraska were a territory, and of course, if that territory wants to become a state, they need to decide, are we going to be free or are we going to be slave? Are we going to choose for ourselves through popular sovereignty, or is the federal government going to make that decision for us? Settlers entering the Kansas and Nebraska territory found no established civil authority. There was no government there. And Congress, against Stephen Douglas, wanted to build a railway through this area, but you couldn't do that without some type of established government because the railroad's going to bring towns and people and businesses. So, to make matters worse, though, by opening the two territories to slavery, the Kansas-Nebraska Act would repeal the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1820, because I think there's a map. Nope. Because the southern border of Kansas was right above that line of 3630. So if we were following the Compromise of 1820 or the Missouri Compromise, then automatically Kansas and Nebraska would be free. But clearly we're not following that. Anti-slavery Whigs joined with Northern Democrats and former Free Soilers to form the brand new party of Republicans. So now we have Republicans and Democrats, and these new Republicans were the old Whigs, were the old Northern Democrats, and the old Free Soilers. So something that all of these people have in common is that they're against slavery. They might not be staunch abolitionists, but they're against slavery nonetheless. That's what's uniting them all under the Republican name. That's a very important distinction to make, I think. So, as we continue to talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and what's going on there, Western settlers and Eastern importers all found something to like in the Republican platform, the Republican message. But another new party was formed, and those are the Know Nothings, and we've already talked about them. And what they were uniting under was the hatred of foreigners, specifically Irish foreigners, because of their link to Catholicism. So just prior to the election for the Kansas legislature, meaning like the establishment of the Kansas government, thousands of pro-slavery Missourians, and Missouri is right next to Kansas, like this. Thousands of pro-slavery Missourians temporarily relocated to Kansas, and they became known as the Border Ruffians. They were seeking self-determination. Self-determination is like the right to choose, the right to vote, the right to be represented within a democracy. And so these pro-slavery Missourians were moving to Kansas to try and vote in the election to have Kansas become a slave state. The new legislature, which President Buchanan recognized, promptly declared Kansas as a slave state, and this declaration of them being a slave state and their new government was known as the Lecompton Constitution. Lecompton is a city in Kansas. But abolitionists refused to accept the outcome of Kansas being a slave state, so they set up their own government in the neighboring city, Topeka, and they created their own government known as the Topeka Constitution. Well, you can't have one state and two separate governments, and half the state be free and half the state be slave. And so eventually, let's see, I'm gonna go back to all that. Eventually, Buchanan tried to maintain the status quo, but he opposed the abolitionist activism in the South and the West. And he tried to get the Lecompton, the pro-slavery constitution for Kansas passed, but Republicans voted it down. So James Buchanan, the president, was for Kansas becoming a slave state, but most of the House, the Congress, was Republican, so it never passed, and Kansas became a free state. Now let me back up to the question, who was John Brown and how did he make matters worse for Kansas? So here he is, John Brown. John Brown is a radical abolitionist, so unlike William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote about freeing the slaves in newspapers, John Brown was out doing something about it. And his first rise to fame was his raid on a pro-slavery camp, in which he murdered 5 people from the Potawatomi Native American tribe in 1856, and this was successful. And then he went to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where he also tried to lead another slave rebellion, slaves rising up against their owners. But this is where the revolt failed, and he would be caught and tried and found guilty, and he would be executed for this crime in 1859. And John Brown, he considered himself a visionary. He believed that there's a picture. Never mind. But he believed that he had been sent from God, and God had given him this message to kill anybody who supported slavery. And that's why he was doing what he was doing. And after his execution, Northerners hated him even more, Northerners claimed him to be a martyr for the cause. Like, he died for abolition. He died for trying to free these slaves. This is not a question on your review guide. However, it's just good to be reminded of the event of the caning of Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks. I think this event just shows how passionate people were. Like, these men may not have even been slave owners. Slavery doesn't mean anything to them economically, but it did to their states and it did to their friends and neighbors, and people got very hot and heavy over the issue of whether or not they agreed or disagreed with slavery. So this argument over slavery spilled in the Congress when Sumner, this is him on the floor, when Sumner made personal charges against South Carolina Senator Butler, and Butler's nephew Brooks proceeded to beat him with a cane due to him accusing his uncle of something regarding supporting slavery, obviously because he's from South Carolina. Okay, so we've already talked about that. Moving on to Dred Scott. This is him. Remember Dred Scott? He was a former slave whose master had taken him to territories where slavery was illegal. Thus, rational thinking, he declared himself a free man because, hey, I'm living somewhere where it's illegal to own a slave. So eventually, the case wound up in the Supreme Court where Scott ultimately lost, but there was more to the decision than, oh, you lost and you're still a slave. Taney, who was the Chief Justice at the time, of the Supreme Court, Taney's pro-slavery decision declared that slaves were property, not citizens, and that no black person could ever be a citizen in the United States. Even if you had purchased or ran away and became free, you still could not be a citizen. Taney argued that African Americans could not sue in federal courts, as Scott had done, and Congress could not deny people of their property. So it goes back to that argument of this man paid for this person, thus this person can't just walk away, or he can't lose that person because he's property. Moreover, Taney ruled that Congress could not regulate slavery. This is big because it overruled the Missouri Compromise. Congress can't say, oh, you can have slaves here but not here. Congress can't be over that decision. So Taney essentially told Republicans that their goal, freedom for slaves in the territories, was illegal. Wah, wah, wah. So kind of answering the question of what impact did this decision have on other slaves, it kind of defeated their hopes of ever being free by moving to the West or by purchasing their freedom, because even if they did, they would never be able to become a citizen. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. The Civil War begins in South Carolina secedes in 1860. So we're getting close to the Civil War. Prior to Lincoln, this is him, and this is Stephen Douglas, the guy who wanted to build the railroad through Kansas-Nebraska territory. Before Lincoln was president, he was a senator from Illinois. So in the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, Douglas's campaign for Senate was challenged by Lincoln. Douglas was the incumbent, meaning he was already the senator and he was running for another term, and Lincoln challenges him. Lincoln gave what became a very famous speech called the House Divided speech. He says, a house that is divided cannot endure, meaning we cannot continue to live half slave and half free. Eventually somebody's going to have to give. He was right. But Stephen Douglas challenged him with what was known as the Freeport Doctrine, which said in spite of the Dred Scott decision, slavery could be excluded from states by local legislation. And this idea of, hey, you can or can't have slaves based on local decision was very popular with the people. So Stephen Douglas did win this election for Senate in 1868, but Lincoln emerged as a hero, and now his name was kind of out there for everyone to know. So when it came time for the Democrats to choose their presidential candidate for the presidential election of 1860, their convention was split between Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge. There is a difference between a Northern and a Southern Democrat. Most Southern Democrats supported slavery wholeheartedly, and Northern Democrats may be slavery, and it just depends on the circumstance. A new party in the Upper South nominated John Bell from Tennessee, and they were known as the Constitutional Union Party. But we know who won this election, and that would be Abraham Lincoln with the Republican Party. And you do need to know that Lincoln was a Republican. He was formerly a Free Soiler, but remember the Free Soiler and the Whigs all joined together to create the Republican Party. And as president, he called for the exclusion of slaves in territories. He called for a protective tariff over industry and internal improvements. These are all not just the slavery part, but the protective tariff and internal improvements. Remember, these were parts of Henry Clay's American system that the South didn't like. So it wasn't just slavery that the Souths were against regarding Lincoln's presidential plan, but of course, this is the kicker. So the South warned that if Lincoln, or really if any Republican was elected, they would secede and leave the United States because typically Republicans, most of them had this message. So looky there. He won. Lincoln won 40% of the vote. As you can tell, there's a lot of red here. And the southern states lived up to their word and they seceded from the United States promptly after Lincoln's election, literally months. Lincoln was elected in November, and before he was even sworn into office in December, South Carolina had seceded. So within 3 months, South Carolina seceded, and within 6 months, 6 other states joined South Carolina, including Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. The the states that didn't secede, which would be known as border states, are Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. These gray states are states that seceded after the fall of Fort Sumter, so after 1861, and Jefferson Davis will become the president of the CSA, the Confederate States of America. I wanted to include in here some political cartoons from the election of 1860, just in case you might see these somewhere. So these are all, South Carolina's leading the way in a coffin, but these are all of the other southern states that seceded. And it's kind of saying like death to traitors, like all of you who seceded, this will be the end of you from the federal government. And here we have Lincoln and Stephen Douglas and other members of the government tearing the nation apart due to this secession. Kind of the same idea here, tearing the map of the United States apart. So Lincoln decided to maintain control. How the physical fighting of the Civil War began, Lincoln decided to maintain control of federal forts in the South while waiting for the Confederacy to make a move. Fort Sumter was a U.S. federal fort. So when South Carolina seceded, it was still controlled by the U.S. government. So the Confederacy put a naval blockade around Fort Sumter to force the Union out. It is an island, so eventually they'd run out of food and supplies. So Lincoln sent a ship with medicine and supplies to take to Fort Sumter, but really this was a way to break up the Confederate blockade. So after the fighting began, once Lincoln's ship arrived and the Confederates successfully seized Fort Sumter, Lincoln then initiated war against the South. When he called for 75,000 troops, authorized war spending, and suspended habeas corpus, which is like taking away people's rights. Like you could be arrested without any evidence, etc., which are all forms of executive power. He had declared war and he had officially started the war on the South. So part 2 of the review will pick up here with the beginning of the Civil War, walking through Reconstruction.